Marcus Johnson thought it was just another delivery. One more stop on a long afternoon shift, one more set of boxes to carry, one more building to walk into and walk out of without anyone knowing his name. He had learned a long time ago not to expect much from these moments. Not a thank you, not a second glance, not the kind of recognition that reminded a man he was more than the job he was doing. The boxes belonged to a woman the entire city seemed to know, a CEO whose name appeared on business columns and magazine covers, and the kind of conversations that happened in boardrooms he would never be invited into. But what Marcus did not know, what he could not have known, as he loaded the freight elevator and pressed the button for the top floor, was that this woman had been speaking his name in quiet rooms for months. And when he turned to leave, when he believed the moment was already over, a woman he had never met stopped him cold, with 8 words that would rearrange the entire architecture of his life. Marcus was 34 years old, and he carried himself the way a man carries himself when he has learned that the world does not offer much padding between effort and disappointment. He was broad-shouldered and careful in his movements, the kind of person who placed things down gently, who held doors open without being asked, who said good morning to people in hallways whether or not they said it back. He had grown up in the south side of the city in a neighborhood where ambition was either quietly nurtured or loudly punished. And he had been one of the lucky ones, the kind of boy who stayed curious, who read everything he could find, who earned a scholarship, and graduated with a degree in supply chain management before most of his childhood friends had figured out what they wanted to do with their lives. For nearly a decade, he had worked as a logistics engineer for a mid-sized freight company, managing route optimization and warehouse coordination across 3 regional hubs. He had been good at it. More than good. He had been the kind of employee that managers bragged about to other managers, the kind of person who solved problems before anyone else had named them as problems. And then the company had restructured, and the restructuring had a way of moving in waves, and Marcus had been standing in the wrong place when the last wave hit. He lost his position on a Tuesday afternoon in a meeting that lasted 11 minutes. The HR representative had been polite. She had even seemed sorry. But sorry did not cover rent, and sorry did not feed his daughter. And so Marcus had done what a man does when the floor drops out from under him. He had gotten back up, recalibrated, and found work. The moving and delivery company he joined was not glamorous. He knew that. His coworkers knew that. The clients who buzzed them into their lobbies and pointed toward the service elevators certainly knew that. But Marcus showed up every day in clean clothes, spoke respectfully to everyone he encountered, and did his work with the same precision he had once brought to logistics charts and supply chain models. He had a daughter named Lily, 7 years old, who thought her father was the most important man in the world, and he intended to be worthy of that belief for as long as she held it. He did not complain. He did not explain himself to people who had already decided what he was. He had learned, through years of being underestimated, that the most powerful response to contempt was a quiet, unshakable dignity. It was not that he had no anger. He had plenty of it, stored in places he did not visit often, in the memory of a supervisor who had once talked over him in a meeting as if he had not spoken, in the client who had handed the tip to his white coworker instead of to him, in the small daily accumulations of being looked through rather than looked at. But Marcus Johnson had made a choice, somewhere along the way, to refuse to let those moments define the temperature of his character. He was a good man in a difficult situation, and he understood with a kind of bone-deep certainty that one day the situation would change. He just had to stay good long enough to see it. On the afternoon, everything changed. He loaded 4 large boxes of documents into a company van, checked the address against his clipboard, and drove toward the tallest building on the eastern side of the financial district. The Carter Group occupied the top 4 floors of a 50-story building made almost entirely of glass, and it had the kind of lobby that was designed to make people feel small before they even reached the reception desk. The floors were marble. The ceiling was high enough to make sound behave strangely. 2 security guards sat behind a curved desk that probably cost more than Marcus earned in 3 months, and they looked at him the way people in uniforms sometimes look at other people in uniforms when they have decided which uniform carries more authority. He signed the delivery log, accepted the temporary badge, and was directed to the service elevator around the corner, past the main corridor and behind a frosted glass partition that separated the lobby's public face from its working interior. None of this surprised him. He had been to buildings like this before. He knew the choreography. Sophia Carter was 29 years old, and she had been the youngest CEO in the history of the Carter Group, a technology and infrastructure company her grandfather had founded, and her father had expanded into one of the most influential firms in the region. The press described her as relentless. Business journals called her visionary. Her competitors used other words, less flattering, that said more about them than about her. She had grown up inside the company, the way some children grow up inside churches, absorbing its rhythms and hierarchies before she had language to name them, understanding instinctively that the institution and the family were not separate things. She had gone to the best schools, had interned at firms in 3 countries, had returned home with credentials that silenced the people who might otherwise have questioned whether her last name had carried more weight than her qualifications. The truth was that Sophia Carter was exceptional. She worked harder than anyone else in the building, arrived before the cleaners, and stayed later than the security team. She had a memory for data that unnerved people in meetings, and a capacity for strategic thinking that had, in the 3 years since she had taken the CEO role, doubled the company's valuation and repositioned it in 2 emerging markets. She was, by every external measure, exactly what the world believed her to be. And she was, by every internal measure, profoundly, achingly lonely. The loneliness was not the kind that announced itself. It had no dramatic shape. It was quieter than that, a low, persistent frequency beneath the noise of her days, the sensation of moving through a world in which almost no one spoke to her without an agenda behind the words. Her board members wanted something from her. Her investors wanted something. Even her social circle, the people who invited her to dinners and openings, and the kind of events that photographed well, wanted proximity to what she represented more than they wanted her actual company. She had learned to perform warmth without offering access, to be present in rooms without being truly reachable. And this had made her effective, and had also made her, in the private hours of her life, a person who sometimes sat in her apartment with a glass of wine and tried to remember the last time she had laughed without calculating the impression it might make. She had almost forgotten what it felt like to be spoken to as just a person. Which was why, 6 months before Marcus Johnson appeared at her building with his clipboard and his boxes, she had remembered him. She had been in a coffee shop 3 blocks from the office, sitting at a corner table with a briefing document she was trying to read before a 10 o'clock call, when she had overheard an argument developing near the counter. A woman had been overcharged, and the barista was flustered, and the line behind them was growing impatient, and the situation had that particular social charge that comes when embarrassment and inconvenience collide in a public space. Before Sophia could decide whether to intervene, a man in a company work shirt had stepped forward from the back of the line, spoken quietly to both parties, produced the exact change from his own wallet to resolve the discrepancy, and diffused the entire thing in under 90 seconds, with a kind of easy, unpretentious competence that had stopped Sophia mid-sentence in her own thoughts. He had not made a show of it. He had not looked around to see who was watching. He had simply identified a problem and solved it because it was the reasonable thing to do, and then he had stepped back into line and ordered a black coffee and gone about his morning. She had watched him leave without introducing herself. She had thought about him, on and off, for weeks afterward, not romantically, exactly, or not only romantically, but with the particular attention a person gives to a quality they have almost stopped believing exists. She had mentioned him to her mother once, then again, referring to him only as the man from the coffee shop, the man who had the kind of manners that come from character rather than instruction. She had not expected to see him again. And then one afternoon he walked off a service elevator with 4 boxes under his arms, and she recognized him immediately. Marcus had no idea that the woman standing by the window of the executive floor's reception area was looking at him with anything other than the mild impatience of someone waiting for a delivery. He set the boxes down on the designated surface, produced his electronic signature pad, and was preparing to hand it over when she spoke. She said his name was on the order form, and she wanted to make sure everything had arrived safely. And Marcus said yes. All 4 boxes, no damage, and she said that was good. And there was a brief silence of the kind that happens when a conversation has technically concluded, but neither party has moved. She asked if he wanted water. He said no thank you. She asked how long he had been doing delivery work, not in the way that was an insult, but in the way that was a genuine question. And Marcus, who had long ago developed an accurate radar for the difference, answered honestly. He said he had come from logistics management, that he was between positions, that the work kept him busy, and he was not the kind of person who found a reason to stop moving. She said that made sense. He said it was a nice building. She said she sometimes forgot to notice it. He laughed briefly, almost involuntarily, the small, surprised sound of a person who has been caught off guard by something true. He picked up his clipboard, nodded politely, and left. In the elevator on the way down, he thought about the brief exchange and found it, without being able to say exactly why, pleasant. On the executive floor, Sophia Carter stood by the window and allowed herself, for the first time in several weeks, to smile without thinking about what the smile was for. What happened in the days that followed was not invisible. Office environments are extraordinarily porous systems, and the currency of observation flows faster in them than almost any other kind of information. People noticed that Sophia Carter, who had the kind of controlled professional affect that made even her assistants slightly nervous, had exchanged what appeared to be an informal and unhurried conversation with the man who had delivered the document boxes. People noticed that she had not checked her phone during those 3 or 4 minutes, which was, for Sophia, essentially unprecedented. And people talked about this, as people do, with the particular energy of those who sense that the pattern of something familiar has shifted without quite being able to name what that something is. The speculation was not kind. A woman at the front desk told a colleague that she had seen the CEO laugh, actually laugh out loud, which she delivered, as though reporting a minor miracle. A senior analyst made a comment in the break room that Marcus, who did not hear it, would have recognized as the specific category of contempt reserved for people who are considered to be overstepping. And an older member of the board, a man named Richard Hargrove, who had been on the Carter Group's governing body for 12 years, and who had a firmly fixed idea of what the company's leadership should look like and who it should associate with, had watched the interaction from across the corridor with an expression of careful, controlled displeasure. Sophia was aware of none of this, or rather, she was aware of it in the abstract way. A person is aware of whether it existed. It had some capacity to affect things, but it did not change her intentions. She found herself, in the weeks that followed, identifying reasons to have additional deliveries sent to the building, not frequently enough to be obvious, not transparently enough to embarrass herself, but enough that the same service company appeared on her building's delivery log 3 times in the space of 6 weeks, and twice Marcus was the person who came. Their conversations grew incrementally longer, without ever becoming anything other than professionally appropriate. She asked his opinion, once, about a logistics problem. She was working through a distribution bottleneck in one of their infrastructure projects, and he answered with the kind of fluent, detailed competence that had characterized his former career, and she had found herself leaning forward slightly without noticing she was doing it. He spoke about supply chain dynamics with the same easy authority he brought to everything else, and when she asked a follow-up question, he answered it directly, without performing deference, without calibrating his intelligence downward to manage her comfort. And Sophia thought, there it is again, that quality, the one I almost stopped believing, existed. She did not tell him that. She filed it carefully and moved on with her day. But she thought about it later, in the quiet of her apartment, and she recognized the feeling for what it was, the specific warmth of a person beginning, slowly and with appropriate caution, to look forward to something. She had begun mentioning him to her mother without entirely realizing how often she was doing it. Her mother, Evelyn Carter, was the kind of woman who had been described, at various points in her long life, as perceptive, formidable, and occasionally inconvenient, all 3 of which were accurate. She was 61 years old, had raised Sophia largely on her own after her husband's early death, and had the deeply calibrated emotional intelligence of someone who has had to read rooms accurately for survival. She and Sophia spoke several times a week, and she had noticed, over the course of 3 or 4 months, that the name Marcus appeared in her daughter's conversation with a regularity that exceeded coincidence. Sophia mentioned him casually, the way people mention things they are pretending not to think about embedded in other sentences, offered as illustrations of unrelated points, dropped in and quickly covered over again. The man from the delivery company said something interesting about infrastructure optimization. A man I know through work he handles logistics told me this thing about efficiency that I keep coming back to. I ran into Marcus again. Isn't that funny? He was doing another delivery. Evelyn had listened to each of these with the patience of a woman who had raised a daughter and therefore understood exactly what was happening and had said nothing, had waited, had allowed the accumulation to continue until she judged that the moment was right for a different kind of attention. She arrived at the Carter Group building on a Tuesday afternoon, having arranged to have lunch with Sophia, and Sophia had been pulled into a meeting that was running long, as Sophia's meetings always did, and Evelyn had been shown to a seating area near the executive corridor to wait. She had been sitting there for perhaps 10 minutes when the service elevator opened, and Marcus Johnson walked out with 2 boxes of archived documents and a clipboard. She watched him. He greeted the receptionist by name. He had apparently been there often enough to know it, and the receptionist smiled at him, the involuntary kind of smile that people produce for people they actually like, rather than people they are professionally required to be pleasant to. He set the boxes down carefully, signed the delivery confirmation, and was making his way back toward the elevator when he nearly walked past her and she spoke. She said, "Excuse me." He stopped and turned, and she looked at him with the thoroughness of a woman who has learned that first impressions are data, and she collected what she saw: the broad, composed steadiness of him, the way he met her eyes without aggression or apology, the quality of his stillness, which was not passivity, but something more like self-containment, the particular kind of ease that belongs to people who do not need the room to tell them who they are. She saw it all in a matter of seconds, and she smiled, and she said, "So, you're the man she talked about." Marcus went very still. He was not a person who was easily rattled, but something about the sentence, its precision, its completeness, the implication contained in all 7 words, landed differently than he had anticipated. He asked what she meant, and Evelyn Carter, who had no interest in pretending to be unclear, told him simply that her daughter had mentioned him, more than once, across several months, and that she had been curious enough to want to see for herself who he was. She did not elaborate on what she had seen. She did not need to. She asked him a few gentle questions: how long he had been working in the area, whether he liked the city, whether he had family, and Marcus answered with the careful, measured honesty of a man who does not know yet if this is a test, and she listened with the attention of a woman who already knows the answer she is looking for. When they parted, she thanked him for his time, and he walked back to the elevator, carrying with him the strange, slightly disorienting weight of a new understanding. The understanding that the woman who had spoken to him on the executive floor, the woman he had thought of as just a pleasant client, the woman whose brief conversations had lodged themselves in his memory with a persistence he had chosen not to examine too closely, had been thinking about him, had been saying his name in rooms he had never entered, had been carrying him with her in a way that meant something. He drove back to the depot in a state of careful, complicated quiet. His first instinct, and he recognized it immediately for what it was to retreat. He had been here before, or somewhere adjacent to here, the territory of possibility, where something good might be beginning, and where the distance between his life and someone else's life becomes visible in a way that is not comfortable to look at directly. He had spent the last 2 years building a life that was stable and manageable and defined by what he could control, and the idea of stepping outside those boundaries, of allowing himself to want something that existed in a different register than the life he was currently living, was frightening in the particular way that hope is frightening when a person has learned to be careful with it. He thought about the building, about the marble floors, and the frosted glass, and the service elevator that went up the back of the structure, while the main elevators opened onto lobbies with flowers. He thought about the conversations in boardrooms, about the world Sophia Carter moved through, about the gap between her life and his that was not merely financial, but structural, built into the architecture of the city itself, into the social codes of the environments she inhabited, into the quiet but consistent way in which certain people in certain buildings made certain other people feel that the distance between them was not temporary but permanent. He thought about what Lily would think, not of Sophia, whom she had never met, but of the idea that her father had allowed himself to want something large, something outside the careful boundaries they had built together. He thought about what it would mean to bring a new person into the orbit of his daughter's life and have it not work, about the specific damage that optimism could do when it was misplaced, about all the times he had miscalculated what a situation was and had paid for the miscalculation in ways that took longer to repair than he had anticipated. He thought about the board member in the expensive suit who had not looked at him when issuing instructions, about the dozens of small variations on that moment that had accumulated over 2 years into something that felt less like individual incidents and more like a cumulative verdict. He thought about the reception desk where the young woman had smiled at him with genuine warmth, and he thought about the service elevator, and he thought about the 8 words Evelyn Carter had spoken, with a directness that had held in it something he was not accustomed to receiving. Simple, unhierarchical recognition. He turned all of this over during the drive, and by the time he reached the depot, he had arrived at the same decision a cautious man always arrives at when hope presents itself uninvited. He decided, carefully and with the self-protective logic of a man who had been disappointed before, to be less available, to take other routes, to be, simply, more difficult to find. Sophia noticed. She noticed the way people notice things they were not supposed to be tracking, with the specific discomfort of realizing that you have been paying more attention than you admitted to yourself. The next delivery to the building was handled by a different driver, the one after that as well. She told herself this was neutral, told herself it meant nothing, told herself that a person who made deliveries for a living was not obligated to be the person who made her deliveries specifically, and all of this was true, and none of it helped. She found herself, in the margins of meetings, thinking about the last conversation they had had, turning it over for evidence of some misunderstanding, something she had said that might have shifted something. She thought about her mother's visit, about the easy frankness of the way Evelyn had spoken to him, and she wondered, with a slightly sick feeling, whether the directness had frightened him, whether the collision of 2 worlds, the service elevator and the executive corridor, had made the situation uncomfortable in a way she had not anticipated. She did not reach out. She had enough self-possession for that, enough awareness of the asymmetry between her position and his, to understand that any move she made would carry a kind of institutional weight, that an ordinary gesture would not, and she would not use that weight. She sat with the discomfort and kept working, and told herself it was fine, that she was fine, that she had been fine before, and would continue to be fine. She was in the middle of a board presentation when it happened. Richard Hargrove had been building toward the moment for several weeks. She understood that in retrospect had been accumulating social permission from other board members through a series of small, strategic grievances about leadership optics and professional image. The New Holman name, Braces. None of the documents was relevant to none of the discussion, and yet somehow Hargrove managed to work him into the room anyway. A reference, casual and contemptuous, to the kind of company the CEO had been seen keeping, a remark about appearances and what they signaled to institutional investors, a comment that was designed to sound like strategic counsel, but that was in fact a social weapon, and one that landed hard enough to create a silence in the conference room that had a specific, ugly texture. The other board members looked at their documents. Sophia looked at Hargrove. And Sophia Carter, who had spent her professional life learning to manage her responses, who had been counseled since her earliest days in the company about the political cost of emotional visibility, felt something clear and uncomplicated move through her, and she set her pen down on the table and spoke. She did not raise her voice. She did not perform anger. She addressed Hargrove directly and said that she was not willing to have that kind of conversation in this room, that the man he was referring to had conducted himself with more professionalism and integrity than many people she had met in the course of running this company, and that she evaluated people on their character rather than their job title, and that she expected everyone at this table to operate by the same standard. The room was very quiet. Hargrove's expression did not change, but something in it tightened, and Sophia held the silence that followed without filling it. And after a long moment she picked up her pen and redirected the meeting to the agenda item they had been discussing. The conversation moved on. But something had shifted, and everyone in the room understood it. And some people were uncomfortable with the shift, and some people, quietly, were not. What Sophia did not know, what she had never thought to investigate, because it had not been relevant to any version of their interaction she had imagined, was that Marcus Johnson had spent 9 years as a senior logistics engineer, overseeing operations that moved tens of millions of dollars of freight annually across a regional network. She did not know that he had built and managed teams, that he had presented to clients and negotiated contracts, and solved the kind of complex, high-stakes operational problems that companies like hers paid significant money to consultants to address. She did not know any of this because he had not told her, because he was not the kind of person who introduced himself with a resume, and because the system of visual cues that people use to assign professional standing had, in its consistent and systematic way, directed everyone in her building to look at his uniform and see the category it represented rather than the person wearing it. He was not hiding. He had simply been assigned to a category that did not require anyone to look more closely, and so no one had. And Marcus had lived quietly inside that invisibility, and worked and raised his daughter and carried on. It was her mother who told her. Evelyn, who had asked Marcus a few gentle questions during their brief conversation in the reception area, had done what Evelyn always did with information. She found interesting she had looked into it further. She mentioned to Sophia, a few days after the board meeting, what she had learned. And Sophia had sat with this for a while, had turned it over, had thought about what it meant and what it did not mean and what she wanted to do with it. What she did not want to do was use it as leverage. Did not want to call him and say, "I know what you did before. I see your credentials. I understand your value in the terms my world understands value." That felt like the wrong kind of recognition. What she wanted was simpler and harder than that. She wrote him a note. Not a formal communication, not a professional inquiry. A handwritten note, folded into an envelope, delivered through the company's operations manager with a message that said only, "If you'd be willing to have dinner, I'd be glad for the company. No office, no agenda. I'll understand if the answer is no." Marcus read the note twice, slowly, in the parking lot of the depot at the end of his shift. He sat in his van for a long moment after. He thought about Lily, who was at her grandmother's for the evening. He thought about the elevator, the marble floors, the board member in the expensive suit. He thought about Evelyn Carter's face when she had said those 8 words, the unperformed kindness in it, the way she had looked at him, as though she was seeing exactly what was there and had found it to be enough. He thought about the person he had been before the restructuring and the person he was now, and whether those two people were really as different as the world seemed to need them to be. He thought about fear, about the specific shape of the fear that tells a person to stay inside the boundaries of what is safe and familiar. And he thought about what he had taught his daughter, sitting at the kitchen table, helping her with homework, about the difference between a reason and an excuse. He folded the note back along its original crease. He put it in his shirt pocket. He drove home, showered, changed into his best pair of trousers and a shirt that did not belong to a uniform, and he drove to the address she had written at the bottom of the page. She had chosen a small restaurant in a neighborhood that was comfortable without being ostentatious, the kind of place where the food was good and the lighting was warm, and no one would be watching to see who came in with whom. She was already there when he arrived, sitting at a corner table without her phone out, and she looked up when he walked in, and there was nothing complicated in her expression, just the simple, transparent relief of a person who had not been certain the other person would come. He sat down. The waiter brought water. For a moment neither of them spoke, and then they both started at the same time, and they both stopped, and they both, at that exact moment, laughed, the real kind, the involuntary kind, the kind that happens when two people realize simultaneously that they are equally nervous and that this is, for some reason, funny. The evening unfolded with the particular ease of a conversation that has been building pressure for a long time and has finally found an opening. Sophia talked about the company, not the version she gave to journalists and investors, but the actual daily texture of it, the board politics, the weight of the name she carried, the particular loneliness of occupying a position where people treated her as a symbol more readily than as a person. She talked about the coffee shop, about watching him resolve that situation without making a production of it, about the quality she had been trying to name ever since, and had finally, sitting across from him at this table, found the word for integrity, the kind that doesn't perform itself. She told him that she had thought about that moment, the ease of it, the absence of theater, more times than she had been willing to admit to herself. She said that she had spent the first years of her role practicing a specific kind of presence, confident, composed, strategically readable, and that it had worked, in the sense that it had produced the outcomes the company needed, but that somewhere in the execution, she had misplaced something, some simpler version of herself that had existed before the title and the office and the column inches, and that sitting in the corner of that coffee shop, watching a man solve a small problem with uncalculated kindness, had reminded her, very sharply, of what the something was. Marcus listened with the focused attention of a person who is genuinely present, not formulating his next sentence while she spoke, but actually receiving what she was saying. And this simple, increasingly rare thing made Sophia feel something she had not felt in a long time. She felt heard, not handled, not managed, actually heard. He talked too, more than he usually did with someone he barely knew, more than he had talked about these things in a long time. He talked about the restructuring and what it had done to his sense of himself, the way a professional identity can become structural in ways you do not notice until it is removed, and you find yourself standing in a space where you cannot locate the walls. He talked about the particular experience of being a black man in professional environments, the accumulation of small indignities that each individually could be dismissed as minor, and that together formed a weather system you learned to navigate or were consumed by. He talked about Lily, about her drawings, which covered the entire surface of their refrigerator, about the way she narrated her own life, with such unself-conscious authority, that he sometimes thought she was the most truly confident person he had ever met, about what it meant to be the only constant in a small person's world, and how that responsibility had been, in the difficult years, the thing that kept him oriented. Sophia listened to all of this, with the quality of attention she had rarely received from anyone, and she thought about all the conversations she had sat through in the previous 3 years, and how thin they had been compared to this one, how much they had required her to manage and perform and produce, while this one required her only to be present, which was, it turned out, both much simpler and much harder. They stayed until the restaurant began clearing its tables around them, which was how they knew it was late. Walking to their cars, the city at that hour, having the specific quality of a place that has given up its daytime self and become something quieter and more honest. Marcus stopped at the intersection near the parking garage and said that he had spent several weeks trying to talk himself out of being here. He said it plainly, without apology for the hesitation, only acknowledging that it had existed. Sophia said she was glad he had talked himself out of it less successfully than he had intended. He said that was one way to look at it. She said it was the correct way. He smiled, and it was the full version of the smile, the one that used his whole face, and she thought about the first time she had seen it, standing by the window on the executive floor, and how she had known even then that it was something she wanted to see again. The weeks that followed were not uncomplicated. They were not supposed to be. The board member made his views known through the particular channels available to men of his position and temperament, and there was a period of institutional friction that Sophia managed with the precise, controlled steadiness that had built her career. Some people expressed concern about optics, about appropriateness, about the appearance of various things, and Sophia listened to each concern with the patience of someone who has heard the argument before, in different forms, about different subjects, and who understands that the argument is not actually about what it presents itself as being about. Some of her social circle went quiet in the way that social circles do, when the person at the center stops behaving in the expected manner. And some people, to their genuine credit, surprised her colleagues, who said privately that they admired the way she had addressed the board, friends who asked to meet Marcus with an openness that was not performed, people who turned out to be better than their contexts had required them to be. Evelyn Carter met them for dinner 6 weeks after the restaurant evening, at a proper family gathering at the house where Sophia had grown up, and she had brought her mother's cooking and her grandmother's table settings and the particular warmth of a household that has, at its center, a woman who understands what it means to make a person feel welcome. Marcus arrived with Lily, who had been told simply that they were going to have dinner with a friend, and who had brought a drawing she had made at school that week, because she always brought a drawing when she went somewhere new. Lily surveyed the house with the systematic thoroughness of a 7-year-old conducting reconnaissance, accepted a piece of pie from Evelyn with the grave formality of a small person trying to be polite, and then climbed onto the couch next to Sophia and asked, without preamble, if she wanted to see the drawing. Sophia said yes. Lily unfolded it and explained, at length, what each element meant, and Sophia listened with the complete, unfiltered attention she gave to important things, and Marcus, watching from across the room with a glass of iced tea in his hand, felt something settle in his chest, a tension that had been there for a long time, the sustained effort of a man braced against the possibility of loss, releasing, very slowly, like a fist unclenching. Evelyn sat beside him after dinner, on the porch, while Sophia and Lily debated something in the living room that seemed to involve considerable disagreement about the best way to stack couch pillows. She said, without looking at him, that her daughter had not mentioned anyone with that kind of frequency since before she had become the person the company needed her to be. She said that she had missed the version of Sophia who talked about ordinary things, who had opinions about things that did not involve quarterly reports, who laughed the way she had laughed when she was 20 and the weight of the name had not yet fully settled onto her shoulders. She said, "My daughter hasn't talked about anyone the way she talks about you." And Marcus, who had heard a version of those words before, and who understood now what they meant and what they did not mean, and what the responsibility of them was, said that he intended to be worthy of that. Evelyn looked at him then and said, "I know. That's why I'm telling you." In the months that followed, things changed in the incremental, undramatic way that real things change, not in a single transformative moment, but through the accumulation of small, consistent choices made by people who have decided to choose each other. Sophia began leaving the office before 8 o'clock in the evening, which her assistant noted in her private diary as a historic development. She started taking Sunday mornings off entirely, something she had not done in 3 years, and she spent them doing things that had no strategic value and no deliverable outcome, walking through the market near Marcus's neighborhood, sitting at Lily's kitchen table while the child explained her drawings with the comprehensive authority of an artist presenting to a gallery audience, cooking with Evelyn on the occasional afternoon, when the 3 generations of women who had somehow gathered around Marcus Johnson's life managed to be in the same kitchen at the same time. She felt, in these hours, the return of something she had mourned, without quite being able to name the ordinary texture of a life that belonged to her rather than to the company, the experience of being in a room for no reason other than that she wanted to be there. Marcus, through a conversation that Sophia had initiated with appropriate delicacy, making it clear that the offer stood independent of anything between them, and that he was free to decline without consequence, applied for a logistics operations director role that had opened within one of the Carter Group's infrastructure subsidiaries. He applied because his credentials were exactly right for it, because he had spent 9 years building precisely the competency it required, and because he had decided, quietly and with the finality of a man who has stopped waiting for permission, that the detour in his life had been a detour, and not the destination. He was offered the position after a thorough interview process in which he was assessed, as he had always been capable of being assessed, on the substance of his knowledge and the quality of his thinking, and he accepted it, and he began, for the first time in 2 years, to inhabit a professional role that matched the architecture of who he was. None of this was without difficulty. The board member remained a source of institutional friction, and there were conversations that Sophia had to have, clearly and without equivocation, about the culture of the company she was leading, and what it would and would not accommodate. There were people who watched the situation and drew conclusions, some of which were fair and some of which were not. And Marcus had to navigate that with the same patience he had always brought to the experience of being assessed by people who had decided in advance what they were looking at. But he was not navigating it alone. And this specific change in the texture of his situation was the one that altered everything else. He had someone who spoke plainly to him, who did not manage her words to manage his comfort, who called him on things she thought he was getting wrong, and listened seriously when he disagreed, who had never, not once, in any of their conversations, made him feel that his value was conditional on his circumstances rather than his character. And Sophia had someone who was genuinely happy to see her, not the CEO, not the symbol, not the strategic asset, just her, Sophia, the person who had once watched a stranger be kind in a coffee shop, and had held onto the memory of it like a small warm thing she carried everywhere, waiting to understand what it meant. On a Sunday morning in autumn, Lily sat at the kitchen table in Marcus's apartment and drew a picture of 4 people standing in front of a building. She worked on it with the total absorption of a child doing something important, tongue slightly out, crayon moving with deliberate intention. When she was done, she pushed it across the table to Marcus and said, "That's us." He looked at it. The 4 figures were roughly the same height, except for the smallest one, which had a great deal of yellow hair that Lily had explained on previous occasions, was an artistic choice rather than a representational one. He asked who the 4th person was. Lily said, "The lady who listened to my drawing story." He said, "Do you like her?" Lily thought about this with the serious consideration she gave to important questions. Then she said, she really listened, like she actually wanted to know. Marcus looked at the drawing for a long moment. Then he put it on the refrigerator, in the center, where there was still room. There is a particular kind of person who moves through the world with a quality of character that exists independently of circumstance, not because they have never been broken by circumstance, not because they are untouched by the accumulation of what life does to people, but because they have made, somewhere in the deep structure of themselves, a choice about who they will be, regardless of what is done to them. These people are often invisible in the systems that organize human value because those systems run on titles and credentials and the visible markers of position, and a person's quality of character tends not to appear on the metrics by which institutions make their assessments. Marcus Johnson had been invisible in those systems for 2 years. He had worked in service elevators and signed digital receipt forms and been spoken to and looked at in the ways that the people in the lobbies believed was appropriate for someone in his category. And all the while he had remained, underneath the uniform and behind the invisibility, exactly what he had always been: a man of serious competence and genuine decency, the kind of person who resolves a conflict in a coffee shop, not because anyone is watching, but because it is the reasonable thing to do, the kind of person whose presence in a room makes the temperature of that room very slightly more humane, the kind of person a child trusts without being told to, the kind of person a careful woman thinks about for months and cannot fully explain why. The value of a person does not live in their job title, or in the amount of money in their bank account, or in the neighborhood they came from, or the color of their skin. It lives in the quality that makes people remember them when they have left the room, the particular way they listened, the specific manner in which they treated someone who could offer them nothing, the small and consistent choices they made when no one was keeping score. A woman had watched a stranger be that person in a coffee shop and had carried the memory of it for months without entirely understanding why. A mother had watched a man carry boxes and had understood, in the space of a short conversation, everything she needed to know. A child had pushed a drawing across a table and offered, in her direct and uncomplicated way, the only evaluation that had ever really mattered. A board full of powerful people had tried to reduce a man to the category of his circumstances, and a woman who had every incentive to be silent had chosen instead to be clear. And a man who had spent 2 years holding himself very carefully against the fear of being seen and found wanting had finally, one evening, in a small restaurant with warm lighting and no audience, allowed himself to be exactly who he was, and had found that it was enough. More than enough. It had always been enough.